honeys, and welcome to Interstell-art. Today we're going to be talking all about the final frontier and how and when it's connected with the arts. We will be focusing quite a bit on what's commonly considered the space age, the 1950s through 80s, just about. But we're going to rewind back before that as well to see at large what people were thinking about when they addressed space in the arts. So buckle up for blast off, honeys. I'd like to begin by explaining why this episode was hard. Why looking up space and art as keywords is a bad idea. I did so hoping to find paintings, sculptures, artists that I could feature in this episode, and instead ended up just with articles about 2D and 3D, background and foreground, volume and absence in art history instead of the final frontier. That's because, as one Artspur article so eloquently put it, quote, while talking about the definition of space in art, positive stands in this equation for the place occupied by form, while negative is what remains between and around the form's shapes, end quote. But even that mistake turned out to be a good one because the article went on to give a brief analysis of 2001: A Space Odyssey that actually does connect to our theme. The author writes about how our concept of space, whether that be the final frontier or the empty air around forms, as viewers is unbalanced by the lack of a clear set up or down, a set left or right, even as the astronauts within the film seem to have differing senses of direction, and they also have weightlessness. So as we are struggling to get a sense of our own equilibrium, us viewers, the astronauts are completely different. They've got their own styles of movement, their own senses of direction, and it's a really interesting play on the idea of space. Author Eli Anapur writes, quote, the chamber of the spaceship in which the action takes place is not defined in usual terms that help us make sense of the place we are in or of the place we are observing. We are relying on a piece whose expressiveness relies on the loss of spatial orientation in its observers, end quote. So if you ever wondered why you were feeling physically uncomfortable watching that film, that's probably why. And now to really get things going. The two fields of the arts and space science, space exploration have a long and important history of working together, says astronomy.com, because of the mutual benefits to each of doing so. Quote, scientists publish their work in peer-reviewed journals, but astronomical realist painters translate the results to show what distant worlds would look like if we could be there, end quote. So while the scientists themselves are focusing on very specific aspects of quote-unquote reality, spectroscopy, photos, petrology, these are all numerical measurements, the painters are the ones who translate that into the visualizations of what these places, these gases, these whatever might really look like. Even some images taken by reliable scientific sources like the Hubble telescope can be color edited in order to really convey the differences, the nuances of whatever that spatial formation is. Leonardo da Vinci himself described the human experience of Rayleigh scattering, or the preferential scattering of blue light by microscopic particles in the atmosphere, and the reason we see things further away as more blue, a good 400 years before the discovery of a scientific explanation for this phenomenon by the English scientist Lord Rayleigh in the late 1800s. And again, before that scientific explanation was fully articulated, we were still using atmospheric perspective techniques in the arts to reflect what was actually happening in our eyeballs, even if we didn't know the science behind it. Some other important examples come later in the 20th century. One is French artist and astronomy popularizer Lucien Radot, who, during his lifetime of 1874 through 1947, published numerous paintings showing the surface environments of other bodies in our solar system based on then current scientific knowledge. I bring him up because his 1937 book, Sur les Autres Mondes, or On Other Worlds, caught the eyes of leading special effects artists in Hollywood like Chesley Bonestell, who painted the backdrops in famous films like Citizen Kane, and who, in 1949, illustrated his own space landscape book. Bonestell titled his work The Conquest of Space, and it went on to inspire some of the then teenaged Apollo astronauts and crew members. So, to reiterate, honeys, some of the most famous astronauts ever, their love for science, their love for space was born out of the arts. Now that we've got the big picture covered, we're going to officially move along our timeline of art history here. We're going to take a look at pre-modern space representation in it. We'll first take a look at The Astronomer of 1668 by Johannes Vermeer. Vermeer had a relatively short life, only living from 1632 to 1675, but it was a super impactful one. He's known as one of the Dutch masters. Now, this artwork was actually featured in a January 2004 edition of the newspaper emerging infectious diseases, housed in the online National Library of Medicine, and they write, quote, although more than any of his contemporaries, Vermeer saw in everyday activities, his characters, namely the lacemaker, the procuress, the milkmaid, had an air of introspection and seemed to be engaged in more than the activities themselves, end quote. Meaning Vermeer was atypically focused on the quote-unquote mundane people, whereas some of his contemporaries were much more interested in the newly wealthy Dutch patrons of the era. So what's going on in The Astronomer? We see from his left in profile a scholar-philosopher working alone at his desk in front of his study window. He has an astrology globe on his desk which features constellations like Ursa Major, Draco, and more. On the wall opposite us, facing us, is a large clock or maybe a map next to a painting, while on the table itself there are some papers, an astrolabe, and a draped cloth. And a quick note, The Astronomer was a title given to this piece later. It's not the original one, and it would be a little inaccurate given that that is an astrology globe. All the same, this was a super relevant theme for his times in the Dutch Golden Age of 1632 to 75, which was a period of parallel growth and invention in the nation's arts as well as sciences. And here are a few examples of those inventions and discoveries. Christian Huygens developed telescopes and discovered Titan, the largest moon of Saturn, plus he invented the pendulum clock. Jan Swammerdam became the first to observe red blood cells. Vermeer's neighbor and friend in Delft, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, became known as the father of microbiology for becoming the first person to build a microscope powerful enough to allow him to observe living, single-celled organisms. The science side of this growth and development was also connected to money. Quote, the study of the universe was of vital importance to the shipping trade, the cornerstone of the Dutch Golden Age economy, end quote. And we can see these broader shifts, these scientific and economic shifts, reflected in the art pieces as well. Our sources write, quote, while the arts were abandoning classical themes for scenes of everyday life, the sciences were inventing new methods of inquiry, dispelling the shadows of antiquity to view the world through a lens, end quote, literally. So clearly Vermeer was into the scientific part of this national pride as well as the artistic. Tom Anderson for Daily Art magazine writes that two paintings by Vermeer from around this time show scientists at this eureka moment of discovery. Quote, that moment can be seen in The Astronomer as the scientist moves his index finger out of the way to focus on a detail on the globe. The geographer has the same look of amazement on his face as he gazes out with a look of wonderment about his new finding, end quote, and we see other evidence linking these two paintings and that moment of discovery. That evidence includes an atypical inclusion of consecutive dates on these two paintings, the fact that they were made from the same bolt of canvas, they're the same size and use similar props, but alas, time and circumstance has separated the two. Even more telling, the resemblance between the figure in these two works and a later portrait of Van Leeuwenhoek from 1686, it's strong enough that some think he was the sitter for these earlier pieces as well. So an actual scientist in the moment of discovery being depicted. How much more clear of a connection could you possibly have? Our next piece might someday be its own standalone episode, so we'll try and summarize it as best as we can. It's of course Van Gogh's Starry Night from 1889. The iconic piece came 1 year after Van Gogh's first popularly recognizable nighttime work, The Starry Night over the Rhone, but had a different mentality in its approach. In the 89 Starry Night, Van Gogh was looking to try this new challenge of nighttime plein air techniques, trying to make contrasting natural dark blue skies with yellow stars, and without the streetlights of the prior piece. Smart History tells us that, quote, he referenced it repeatedly in letters to family and friends as a promising, if problematic, theme. Inner quotes, a starry sky, for example, well, it's a thing I'd like to try to do, and all quotes, especially without that interference from man-made lighting. 1889's Starry Night also shows more of Van Gogh's medieval woodcut interests, which he thought of as an exercise in quote-unquote deliberate stylization or exaggeration. That inspiration shows up in the piece as thick outlines with simple shapes. But what's really interesting about this piece, says MoMA, is that it is, quote, both an exercise in observation and a clear departure from it, end quote, because he actually painted this in multiple daytime sessions under very different atmospheric conditions at times. Though the piece was inspired by the view from his window at the St. Paul de Mazol Asylum in St. Remy, southern France, where he spent 12 months in 1889 through 90 seeking help with his mental illnesses, Van Gogh has changed the details of the visible landscapes from his window here. He's combined it with a separate view of the town of St. Remy. He additionally additionally added impressionistic interpretations of light to the piece, which is why those stars are so compelling. The humanities' fascination and love for space only continued, so as we get into the modern era here, we see brand new interpretations of space and cosmic bodies by artists like Joan Miró. Known as one of the three titans of Spanish modern art alongside Dalí and Picasso, Miró lived 1893 to 1983. He was, according to Sotheby's, a Catalan painter who, quote, gained renown for his oniric galaxies of stars, moons, eyes, females, and birds, end quote, oftentimes where the woman figure represents the universe and birds represent the earth. Miró often worked with bold yet very limited color palettes and mild gradient backgrounds, which inspired some later color field painters like Helen Frankenthaler. And a bit of important background/life story here. After Miró's move to Paris in 1920, he was no longer able to work outdoors anymore, but he saw this as freeing and, quote, began to assemble a new cosmology of mysterious signs and symbols, end quote. And in fact, his renowned Constellations series began as a happy accident on family vacation in Normandy in 1940. While attempting to clean his brushes with solvent, he found himself no longer just wiping the brushes off on white paper, but sort of painting with the solvent. With a little more intentionality in his approach, this became the Constellations series, which not only, quote, represented an emotional form of liberation from the wartime tragedies taking place around him, end quote, but became his most well-known works. But since we are not focusing just on that series today, we'll go to a different artwork to explore Miró's relationship with space. More specifically, to a piece called Dog Barking at the Moon from 1926. The landscape featured in this piece is really sparse, it's kind of surrealistic, it's kind of cartoonish, and it has a sort of chocolate browny earth and a night black sky. Below, on the ground, a sort of distorted dog, depicted in very bright colors, obviously barks up at the moon above him, while on the left, a ladder in white and yellow extends up into the sky. Writes the art story, quote, the distortions of the moon and the dog, along with the improbability of the ladder, create a sense of play where everything both is and is not what it seems, end quote. And the final work has an important difference from the preliminary sketch. In the years just before he made this work, Miró had begun sometimes including words in his paintings, calling them quote-unquote painting poems. The original sketch for this piece included the moon responding to the dog, quote, you know, I don't give a damn, end quote, in Catalan. And even though there are thousands of possible interpretations for what the moon is meant to represent, what the ladder is, what the dog is, art critic Laura Cummings says the work is famous, quote, as a work of surrealism which has equally been interpreted as a personal manifesto. Here is the young artist as a pup trying to find his voice in the international avant-garde. The beautiful ladder must therefore be his art by which he will ascend, end quote. That interpretation is super interesting to me because I first saw this piece without knowing its title and thought that it was about futility, thought that it was about the efforts that we put towards trying to make something happen and it being literally always out of reach. This fascination with space and science and the significant meanings behind it, the philosophies that we assign to them, continued throughout his career. Miró's 1961 lithograph, Full Moon Over the Earth, is definitely more naturalistic. The moon is more rounded, not very colorful, just has some light spaces, some shadows, and there are only two other more gestural lines across the entire piece, also in white. For me, this is a very peaceful artwork. There's not a lot going on, but the black and the white is not intimidating or stark. It feels very soft and welcoming. The curviness of these two lines also makes me think of maybe a mountain outline, the outline of sand dunes. It seems as though we are potentially viewing a full moon from an outdoor space ourselves. Next, we have Georgia O'Keeffe's Starlight Night, originally produced in 1917, but reproduced in 1963. So I didn't know how to date that. I'm just telling you both. O'Keeffe lived 1887 through 1986, and in some ways, this piece reminds me of Starry Night Over the Rhone because of the repeated yellowy lights and stars pattern of sort of geometric grid of them and the variations in the sky's coloring. And in that way, by making these stars into a sort of geometric pattern, this artwork is also sort of about humanity making sense of the too big to reason with, according to Fayadon. Quote, with this grid of irregular white shapes left amid a wash of watercolor, O'Keeffe not only captured the vastness of the night sky, but also suggested the human instinct to try and impose order and pattern on what we see when we look at the heavens, end quote. The fact that place, literal place, was a factor in each of their works connects O'Keeffe and Van Gogh further. While O'Keeffe's vision was increasingly being inspired by the landscapes of New Mexico, which she visited often and where she eventually moved to from New York to live permanently in 1949, we have, of course, Van Gogh looking at the French countryside. And we get a glimpse of her mentality, her approach in this artwork and at this time in her career as well via a letter she wrote to fellow artist Russell Vernon Hunter. In it, she offers the advice that she herself was putting into practice, quote, "Try to paint your world as though you are the first man looking at the wind and the cold, the dust, and the vast starlit night," end quote. But I think it's important to compare O'Keeffe to O'Keeffe, so another work of hers we'll look at very, very briefly is an Art Institute of Chicago favorite of mine, Sky Above Clouds 4 from 1965. This piece culminates a series inspired by her experiences as an airplane passenger during the 1950s on O'Keeffe's trips around the world. She started the series in 1963 with relatively realistic depictions of small white clouds on a 3x4 canvas, but progressed along the way to more stylized images of the motif on increasingly larger surfaces. I'll admit, honeys, for the longest time, I thought this was a sort of abstracted view of the Arctic ice floes, but obviously, as the title gives away, they are clouds. They are what we see when we are reaching cruising altitude of 30,000 feet or whatever, looking down on the earth below. And therein lies the connection between this cloud series of O'Keeffe's and the science of the time. Jet passenger service, commercial flying for people, really only began in the late 50s in the US. And so in the 60s, it captured this exclusive and new form of exciting travel. Quote, "More people began to fly and air travel became less exclusive. Between 1955 and 1972, passenger numbers more than quadrupled," end quote. So her works encapsulated this transition, this entire revolution in the way that we travel. Just as we see in the Starlight Night piece, we have gradients and shades of blue moving together here in almost watercolor ways, especially in the upper, I'd say 1/4 of the painting. And like in Starlight Night, the piece seems to have a sort of pattern in the way these clouds are organized, laid out as they recede into the distance. We even have some yellow tones out near the horizon line, further connecting the two pieces. So now, honeys, we're back in the 20th century, or at least the middle of it, and this is when a brand new movement comes in. Called the California Light and Space Movement, it was, according to Apollo magazine, quote, "a uniquely Southern California phenomenon. It was named after two attributes that the region boasted in abundance and took advantage of local craftsmanship and fabrication techniques associated with custom hot rod culture, surfboard shaping, and aerospace technologies," end quote. This is a movement that again parallels an age of science and technology, exploration, and advancement. Brand new industrial materials became commercially available, which had been invented for military uses during World War II in the 1950s and 60s, and artists, of course, flocked to them. Most of this group's pioneers lived in Venice Beach and were associated with the renowned Ferris Gallery as well as others in LA, like the Rex Evans Gallery. They were sometimes called the West Coast Minimalists. So, similarities and differences between what we might call the New York minimalism and the California minimalism. Both did believe that the meaning of an artwork was not static and intrinsic, but instead fluid. New meanings could be created by each individual encounter with an artwork in each context. Both sets of minimalists also tended to use industrial or prefabricated materials to create simplified or geometric forms, sans detail, which would emphasize the materiality of the object. But there were enough key differences to distinguish the two. The California faction was even more concerned with the audience's perception of the work than the work's materiality. They especially emphasized elements of time, like durational experiences, and the California movement often only made singular objects, while the East Coasters preferred repetition and seriality. And while the New Yorkers were apparently not that into it, the California artists were paying close attention to the universities and think tanks in the mid-century California context, studying sensory deprivation, human perception, kinesthetic experience, and they wanted to introduce that into their artistic explorations as well. Essentially, they wanted to make art out of this brand new perception research that was coming out of their own local area. This fascination by the group, who I'll be referring to as the CLS artists from here on out, led to combination programs like the 1967 Art and Technology one at the Los Angeles County Museum Museum of Art, LACMA, and the California Institute of Technology program, which launched soon after it. Basically, in the words of Bonham's auction house, quote, "The concepts and ideas that sparked the movement in the 1960s were nothing short of radical. They combined groundbreaking institutional research into the nature of perception with newly developed industrial materials to produce works that centered on the viewer's experience above all else," end quote. So let's talk about some of these CLS pioneers. I'd first like to give an honorable mention for support of the CLS movement to Jack Brogan. LACMA has called him a, quote, "uncommon common denominator and the, quote, fabricator, collaborator, conservator, and right-hand man for an entire generation of California light and space artists," end quote, because he trained as a cabinet maker and furniture finisher on top of his engineering studies. He then worked with Bell, Irwin, Kaufman, Pashkian, and others beginning in the mid-1960s to help them physically produce their works of art and eventually devoted himself fully to the artist's projects. Brogan also created a technique for casting and bonding acrylic that was eventually bought by the U.S. military for use in fighter aircraft cockpits. So that's how connected the American arts and sciences scenes were at the time. You had creative invention impacting the science of military aircrafts. The first actual California light and space artist we'll discuss today is Fred Eversley. He is an artist that I encountered for the first time in my visit to the Nelson Atkins Museum of Kansas City much earlier this year, and he is admittedly the inspiration for this episode. So, Eversley was born in 1941 and passed away in March of this year unexpectedly following a brief illness. He had graduated from the Carnegie Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh and trained in engineering. He went on to work in high-intensity acoustical laboratories projects for NASA and other major aerospace companies like Weil Laboratories, but he lived in Venice Beach at that time and so befriended the local community of artists. Eversley took on a Brogan-esque role at first. He began helping the others produce their art objects, which required highly technical skills, and soon Eversley began creating his own art. He pursued it full-time after a life-threatening car accident in 1967 inspired him to retire from engineering. In 1977, he was invited to work as the first artist in residence in the newly opened National Air and Space Museum, and his work continues to be acclaimed. He was awarded the Lorenzo de' Medici Prize for Sculpture at the 2001 Biennale Internazionale dell'Arte Contemporanea in Florence, Italy. Eversley was perhaps the epitome of the style associated with many artists of the light and space movement, and which was called by critics finish fetish. Art Story explains that that term was first coined by John Copelands in the late 1960s to describe this trend toward the use of plastics with glossy finishes and highly polished surfaces, but Eversley himself called that a, quote, bullshit term, end quote, in some of our source interviews, so we won't use it very much. What was actually going on, reports Bonhams, is that, quote, the artist said that almost all the labor involved in making his work happened in the final step, polishing the rough molded resin to create the shiny uniform look so integral to this style. If anything, this term, finish fetish, is a sort of dismissal of the West Coast work by the East Coast as fried hippie brain stuff. In her counter-argument to the term, Helen Pashkian, another artist we'll circle back to later, said in a separate source, quote, finish fetish is a derogatory term. It's not about finish. The surfaces had to be really perfect because if they weren't, all you would see is the imperfection, end quote. But back to the topic at hand, Eversley. His sculptures, according to our sources, are not only distinguishable, quote, by Eversley's preoccupation with physical energy as a common characteristic of all humanity, end quote, they also really exemplified the group's interests in the atmospheric effects of that particular coastal geography. Hello again, Da Vinci. Eversley initially thought of his sculptures as, quote, kinetic art without using kinetic elements, end quote. He created his famed parabolas via his own invented process of using a tube filled with resin, which would be spun on either a horizontal or vertical axis, and then the excess would be cut away. That process took about 2 weeks. The artist related several times his career-long interest in parabolas back to turntable experiments he did as a kid, fascinated by the history of the bucket theory parabolic water spinning tests dating back to Newton, as well as later versions of it in the 18th century, which used mercury in the spinning attempts. Obviously, that didn't end well for those exposed to the raw substance, but Eversley was ultimately looking to create something that would transcend every possible boundary, every possible demographic which might usually separate people. He said, quote, you don't need to know anything about language, you don't need to know anything anything about anything except the object and you, and your response to it, end quote. And in that way, he very much diverged from the East Coast minimalist thinking of everything has to connect, everything has to relate to something else in art history. Eversley didn't care if anything of his related to art history. So let's take a look at the look of these pieces. First, 1971's Untitled Parabolic Lens. This consists of a highly polished polyester disc with a flat back and a concave front. The layers of it appear to be more red or purple at the outsides and more blue towards the thinner center. What is so special and significant about this piece is that its visible colors and layers shift not only with the lighting conditions, but with the viewer's movement, not unlike how stars, planets, etc. look different based on a different person's location, the telescope they use, the time of year, aka natural lighting, and so on. Many of his pieces do look somewhat similar to this in that Eversley almost exclusively worked with and was interested in parabolic forms. This is because, as he said, quote, "The parabola happens to be the only mathematic shape that concentrates all forms of known energy to the same focal point," end quote. And that's more or less what he was looking to do with the viewer's attention. He wanted to concentrate it all to the same focal point. But we have even further connections beyond Eversley's NASA career to space here. Eversley created his Untitled Black Lenses from 1974 and 1976 based on his own imagination of and known scientific facts about black holes, plus his own production capabilities. But images taken of space since then show a ton of differences between this artwork and the natural forms and colors of real black holes. So, by looking at this artwork, we can see the extent of human knowledge at a given time and how that can be encapsulated by artwork. And all that just by showing how light can be absent or reflected in a given sculpture. And now we'll come back to Helen Pashkian, who was born in 1934 and is still living. Pashkian began her career as an art historian, studying the Dutch Golden Age and the works of Vermeer in Boston, yet another connection, but returned to art making and soon thereafter to Southern California while working toward a PhD at Harvard. She began to work in cast resin then, creating small geometric sculptures in the 1960s. Now, Pashkian was a bit unusual in her artistic practice for the California light and space artists in that she worked in very small and personal sizes rather than monumental ones during its height. And so, as the male members of the light and space movement began to receive critical acclaim, especially in the 1980s, Pashkian was often overlooked. But interest in her career has been revitalized since the 2010 Pomona College Museum survey of her work. Pashkian uses a lot of epoxy in her works, and later in her career would even encase acrylic objects in epoxy. But some of her earlier works were made with polyester resin. Pashkian eventually ditched the polyester resin because it was so toxic, so hard to work with, and her objects would either come out just right or would utterly fail and couldn't be reworked. Epoxy had a bit more flexibility. In addition to her artworks being known as mostly solid pores of the material, they're additionally recognized for movement activation, aka their appearance of shifting, of changing as a viewer moves around or through the artworks. Pashkian also often left her pieces untitled because she wants us to make our own meanings of them. Since the 1960s, 70s, Pashkian has moved on to include larger projects and canvas-based works, but in interviews with Carol S. Allele, performed between 2012 and 2013, she said, quote, "Agnes Martin once said that one only learns from one's failures. If so, I learned a lot. However, as difficult as this material was, it was also quite captivating. As soon as a piece was removed from its mold, it was instantly apparent what would happen in relation to the surrounding light. That was the intriguing aspects of the aesthetic I had envisioned were now taking a physical form. That is what kept me going," end quote. In that way, Pashkian ultimately plays with and connects to space science, space exploration via these ideas of perception, how lenses, even in scientific instruments, change what natural phenomena, like light, we experience. This is a question especially asked by her 1969 piece titled Untitled, which Art Story remarks, quote, "The object seems to alternate between translucence and opacity with exquisite and ever-shifting variations of light, the result of its highly polished surface. As the sphere is illuminated, the vertical acrylic rod at its center creates varying optical effects depending on the illumination," end quote. So from one angle, it may look like a door is opening within this piece. From another, maybe a flower is coming up, so on. Her later installation pieces have this same sense of curiosity. Another piece of hers, first shown at LACMA in 2014, and which is titled Untitled 2012 to 2013, is made up of 8-foot columns of 6 in 2 rows. Each column has a unique object encased inside in order to have each create a unique play with the 5-minute dimming cycle lights. The objects within are refractory and at various heights, so no 2 columns are alike, but every column encourages you to interact with it and see if you can figure out what that object is. See if you can understand why the light is moving through the column the way it is. With her focus on lenses, on perception, on studies of the human psychology, she fits right into that California light and space movement mold. Next up, we have Robert Irwin, who is one of the more popular names out of this movement, I would say. He lived 1928 to 2023. Irwin began his career as a more abstract expressionism aligned painter, but the Broad Museum writes his, quote, paintings, installations, and site-specific sculptures generate what he calls phenomenal presence, end quote. For examples of this, you can look to the Primal Palm Gardens of LACMA, as well as the buildings of Dia Beacon, both of which he designed. And I'd like to feature a quote of Irwin's here because I think it captures a lot about his mentality, his practice, and I just plain agree with it. I love it. Jonathan Griffin writes for Apollo magazine that when he asked as part of an interview with Irwin, is it art or is it politics, that, quote, Irwin is absolutely clear that the purpose of art is not to create a, inner quotes, duck blind from which you can take pot shots at the world. Art is about attending that, end all quotes. So the obvious question is, how was that belief expressed in his artworks? At first, it wasn't quite so clear. If we look at Untitled from circa 1964 to 66, we see a painting made up of thousands of tiny colored dots. It is considered one of the first major works of Irwin's exploring light effects and complementary or not colors within them. So it's important for his career, but we don't see necessarily a clear or novel idea being presented. But if we jump ahead only a few years to Untitled of 1966 through 67, we start to see what Irwin is thinking here. The slightly later artwork is a painted concave aluminum disc spanning 5 feet in diameter and suspended nearly 2 feet away from a back wall. It is specifically lit from multiple angles to cast multiple shadows, and because it is so skinny, it appears as if it emits the light, not just reflects it. Also, because of that thinness, however, the edges of this piece seem to disappear at times, which blurs the distinctions between object, shadow, and wall. So this piece really centers on understanding and perception. We know the disc must be separate from the shadows, but because we can't physically see it sometimes, it messes with our heads a little bit. The piece seems to ask us to reconsider what we define physically as an artwork and messes with our sense of distance, of separation, of connection. And Irwin believed that experiencing this confusion in person was so important. The experiential nature of it was so crucial that he later restricted his artworks to in-person viewing only by, quote, disallowing any of his works to be photographed from the 1970s on because he believed no image could capture the experience his art evoked, end quote. Some art historians and curators agreed with this decision. For example, Evelyn Hankins, who noted that his works, quote, becomes fully present only when you are standing in the physical space experiencing it over a period of time, end quote. Irwin only officially lifted that photography ban somewhat recently when he found a photographer he considered capable of capturing the lighting effects of his installations, one Philip Schultz Ritterman. Untitled of 1966 through 67 was followed up by Disc of 1967 through 68, which is very physically and conceptually similar, as well as Untitled of 1969, which is a single spray-painted convex plastic disc cantilevered 12 inches away from the wall and with 4 lights arranged around it to produce an array of overlapping shadows. Once again, we as viewers cannot easily tell where or what is disc, shadow, or wall. Spruth Maggers explains that Irwin began his so-called interventions, quote, probing the aesthetic potential of exhibition spaces by dismantling familiar patterns of perception and directing viewers' attention to environmental qualities that already existed in a given space, end quote, in the 1970s. Some of these were small or unnoticeable, blended into the architectural additions, but others were completely undeniable. In one of his first interventions into an empty gallery at MoMA in 1970, he used a scrim material, which was opaque and or translucent, depending on your angle, to make a drop ceiling which covered half of the space. Writes Griffin for Apollo magazine, quote, hardly anyone noticed, which was partially partially the point, and end quote. On the other hand, we have the fluorescent light tube installation titled Light and Space in 2007, which covered an entire wall of the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego. And last for the day, but certainly not least in our hearts, Mary Corset. Born in 1945, her childhood art exposure was actually based on the New York art scene. She studied Joseph Albers, Hans Hofmann, and others in her childhood lessons. Corset's first explorations with light and space were largely made up of light boxes, the creation of them using her knowledge of physics, including how to make white fluorescence with argon gas and Tesla coil. She did that a lot in 1966 while studying at the Chouinard Art Institute of LA. Corset eventually shifted her focus from two-dimensional works to sculpture to immersive installation and environments, but painting, especially her famed white reflective paintings, remained a key part of her practice. Not only have her techniques included the use of electric light and ceramic tiles, says Dia Beacon, she uses glass microspheres as well. In Corset's work Untitled from 1967, we see an essentially hanging lighted area about 6 feet square and 5 inches deep with clear plexiglass on each side. Corset invented frequency generators to put into the gallery walls to create the appearance of a self-sustaining floating light here. It's like the sun, but geometric. And the emphasis on science here, on light and hidden frequencies, is also a pretty strong artistic statement because this was, the 60s, was a decade where Corset says she, quote, didn't want any human touch, end quote, like distinguishable brushstrokes in her work. Quote, I think at those times I was trying to make an object with an objective truth, end quote. What I found fascinating about that statement, though, is that for Untitled 1967, Corset had to take physics classes and pass a test from Edmund Scientific to even be allowed to purchase the generator used in this work, and that too informed her practice. In that same Brooklyn Rail interview with Alex Bacon, where she says she didn't want any human touch in that decade, she explains, quote, but when I was taking the physics class, I started studying quantum physics, and all this stuff started coming together, and I realized that there is no objective truth, end quote. And with this realization of no objective truth, Corset was completely free to imagine a new way of paintings emitting light, and this was it. She followed up the 1967 piece with Untitled Electric Light from 1968, which is a semi-translucent white box with snow white light coming from it within very similarly, except this time you can't see the clear edges of the internal box nor the tubes that it holds, the fluorescent tubes. You're only able to see the exterior casing from an angle as well. But I know I left you kind of hanging on those glass microspheres, honey, so let's circle back. I think the easiest way to understand her use of these is through the artworks, so a breakdown of Untitled Light Painting Grid from 1970. Untitled Light Painting Grid of 1970 utilizes glass microspheres embedded within a white acrylic paint in a subtle grid formation, which pick up on and refract any light at all around them. Glass microspheres, importantly, are an industrial product. They are used in highway markings to make them light up, and that is exactly what inspired Corset here. Her use of the microspheres here creates a subtle reflective surface that appears to recede or advance in a checkerboard-like pattern as the viewer moves around in front of the work or to the sides of it. Just like with the works of Eversley, Pashkian, and Irwin, the duration, the position-driven changes by the viewer, their own choices, determine their experience of the artwork based on these scientific plays of perception, inspired by and utilizing the tools of the space age's technology and discoveries. Corset herself said of it, quote, the painting is not really on the wall, it's in your perception. It also brings in time, the time to walk along the whole thing. They forgot it should be light and space and time, end quote, when they were naming the movement, of course. All in all, this piece embodies Corset's belief that painting doesn't have to be paint and canvas, but is about instead, quote, the flatness, the light, and the space, end quote. And her return to painting stands in contrast to many other California light and space artists. We love a lady not afraid to stand out. There are, of course, many other California light and space artists that we could talk about today. For example, James Turrell and his piece Meeting, but I already covered that one back in the first episode of our Art That Pisses People Off series called Getting in Your Space. And I think I have hammered my point home pretty well by now, so let's wrap up with the legacies of this movement and where we stand today in terms of space and art. Writes Bonham's Auction House, quote, the immersive environments and experiential installations pioneered by the light and space artists paved the way for abstract color theory contemporary artists like Phil Simms, Anne Appleby, and David Simpson, and a second generation of artists have continued the legacy of the light and space movement into the contemporary movement, most notably Olafur Eliasson, Tara Donovan, Spencer Finch, and Andy Moses, end quote. Born in 1967, aka the middle of the light and space movement, Eliasson is an Icelandic-Danish artist known for huge-scaled installation art pieces, especially ones that employ elemental materials, ones like light, water, and air temperature to really submerge the viewer in this environment that he creates. Arguably, his most famous work is The Weather Project from 2003, which was set in the Tate Modern. For that piece, he created a giant hanging sun that emitted a warm light and which was hung high on one of the short walls of the rectangular space. They shut off all the other lights in this turbine hall where it was presented, and its audience was invited to simply come and enjoy, and they did. You had multiple people throughout their visits laying on the floor using their coats as like picnic blankets. Others treated it like it was a real sun, trying not to stare for too long at the center of it. What I can't stress enough here, honeys, is that this was one of the first major installations of its kind, period. Not before this moment had anyone tried to so holistically create the illusion of a meteorological event. Another crucial piece of this installation is that the entire ceiling of the turbine hall was covered in mirrors. So even as they were observing the sun, there was this sort of observing from above effect for the viewers of seeing themselves reflected in the ceiling. In some ways, it's almost like the sun and the viewers themselves were outside the boundaries of the earth, reflected in the mirrors above, or maybe vice versa. In any case, it became unclear in this installation what was earthly, what was extraterrestrial, and what the divisions were between the natural and the man-made. And in that sense, we can consider Eliasson's Weather Project as an expansion of the sorts of questions surrounding Corset's hanging light boxes, wire-free light boxes. We could even take it back further to Van Gogh and O'Keeffe's interests in natural versus unnatural man-made lighting and sky. Eliasson's project almost acts as a bridge between those ongoing questions and the contemporary eras of both the arts and space sciences, going on show only 7 years after the successful launch of the first Mars rover. The Weather Project also provided a glimpse at the future success of immersive exhibitions like the Van Gogh installation, which would come about within the 2010s, 2020s. And the only other thing I think it's important to note for this particular episode, honeys, is the amount of space-themed or space landscape set art that's coming out of the AI generators. It's very strange to me to think that, given we started this episode by talking about how important it is for astronomical realist painters to give us a sense of perception of the things we can't see in space, that's also now being done by machines. So we have to wonder what the future of the arts and space science intersection is going to be when that part of it is getting cut out. I find myself wondering what place is left for humanity if we're turning over the arts of space science to non-human entities. Do we have any place left in that field? The answer for artists might be none at all. And given the very long history, shared history, fruitful history of space arts and sciences, that would be a damn shame. Now that I've had my little soapbox moment, we are done for the day, honeys. I hope you have learned something about space and arts and why the two are fun to put together, even if very hard to research. Remember to like, follow, subscribe, comment, whatever on all of our platforms, streaming, Patreon, and otherwise. We'll be back next week with a new business for you, some updates on all things arts world. But until then, stay safe, hydrate or dihydrate, take care of yourselves. We'll talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnout. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.